Hey everyone, Warwick's here. So we're back with another video. This time we're going to be doing a overall tank rankings. Now I'm not doing a tier list like you're seeing a lot of people do, just because I think tier lists are antiquated and are at a point where people don't take them seriously anymore. So I wanted to do a point scale system, similar to what I've seen at least one other creator do. So what I'm doing here is we're going to look at 4 aspects of tanking, and we're going to look at this kind of as a general purpose. This is not specific to Raid or Mythic Plus, although we'll talk about the situations where some variation might be warranted in the point system. And as you can see, we are doing this based off of tankiness. So this is going to include their ability to mitigate, be defensive, and we're also looking at things like self-sustain in this as well. Damage is what it is, damage. Mob control, how much can a tank do to put mobs in different places, keep them where they are, things like that. Just how much control can they have over a pack. And this is just kind of in a vacuum solo. We're not including what other party members do. And then group utility. What can they bring to a party that makes them effective as both a tank and then also as a party member. Now, as you can see, we are doing this on a split scale. So tankiness and damage are going to be out of 5 points. Mob control and group utility out of 3 points. This is because the latter two, you can easily fill the gaps in the party if you need to with other specs and other roles. So while these things are, I think, useful in a conversation about how effective are the tanks, I think overall they aren't as important as how much they live and how much damage they do to help make packs and keys and raid bosses die faster. So we're going to do this in order of spec alphabetical order. So Blood Death Knight's going to start us up. Blood Death Knight has a really good combination of defensive cooldowns. I think that right now, at least from the testing and conversations that I've had with other tanks, that Blood DK is going to be in a pretty solid spot, but there is concerns about how much gear it needs before it just starts to get overwhelmed by the amount of damage coming out. I'm going to give it 4 points. So basically it's got obviously the strongest self-sustain of any tank. It's kind of built around the idea of being self-sustained, but it also has really strong cooldowns in Vampiric Blood, Icebound Fortitude, AMZ, AMS, and Lichborn if you talent it into the DR. That allows you to just kind of always have something up for any mechanic that happens to come into place. It also has things like Tombstone, which gives a big absorb shield. Mastery is now becoming more important as their blood shield is becoming more powerful, things of that nature. So overall, I think Blood Death Knight is going to be really good. The sort of degenerate Dancing Rune Weapons playstyle has been heavily controlled by Blizzard coming into this. It still exists, but on a much more capped state to where it's not dominating the gameplay style. So that is there. So if you mismanage your Bone Shield, or if you just don't mismanage your cooldowns a little bit, you are still going to be able to get basically popped. But they handle almost all types of damage really well. They can handle magic damage really well through AMZ, AMS. They can handle physical damage well through Vampiric Blood, through Icebound Fortitude, and then of course bleed damage as well through Death Strike. Bleeds, diseases, things that maybe don't get dispelled right away. So overall, they're really good, but I worry that like as we start getting into harder and harder content, as you start pushing into say the 20 keys for max vault value, or into the cutting edge mythic rating or cutting edge keys, kind of from that standpoint, I think it's eventually got a cap. And there are just other tanks that I think do better with the overall, with kind of the overall damage output. From a damage standpoint, I'm going to give it a 3.5. I lean towards 4 a little bit on this as well. Like there is a possibility I could up this to 4 as well. Blood DK got some recent buffs that just kind of helps their damage across the board. They were already pretty strong in AoE damage with Shattering Bone in particular, doing a lot of work in the AoE aspect. They were very much struggling at single target. They did get some buffs to help their single target, but it also kind of helps their AoE as well. So Blood Death Knight potentially has the possibility of going into a 4th point here rather than getting 3.5, but I'm going to lean conservatively and say 3.5 for now. As Blood Death Knight gets more gear, I think you can see the Blood Death Knight's damage will continue to go up, but kind of the concerns that I have with the tankiness, there's a little bit of concerns with the damage output as well, is that eventually you're just going to be focused too much on living rather than trying to spec into a more sort of damage oriented build. From a mob control standpoint, I'm going to give them 2 points here. I think the grips are obviously very powerful. You can have double death grip now with a talent in your spec tree. You can have Gorfian's Grasp and a reduced cooldown on Gorfian's Grasp if you decide to spec into that build playstyle as well. So you have really good ways to get mobs out of the way, and then you also have your Death and Decay slow, which is very powerful on weeks that you need to kite away. So you can displace mobs, pull a mob out of Sanguine, or you can get mobs slowed away from you if there's like a fat bolstered mob and you need to get away from that mob because it's going to clap your cheeks. Then you have the ability to be able to do that on a relatively decent scale without needing assistance of your party. Ultimately, the reason why it doesn't get 3 points, or even potentially even more than 2, is because all of that does have cooldown timings on it. It's not going to be something that you can do all the time. So there will be a point if you're having to kite long enough, or if you have to displace too many mobs in one pull, that you are not going to be able to do that. And you're going to have to rely on your party to do so. From a group utility standpoint, I'm going to give them 1.5 points here, kind of in the middle point. Battle res obviously is a big factor in Death Knight's group utility. It's kind of the biggest thing they bring. AMZ is a decent magic cooldown that can be useful, and they have the best AMZ because it's based off versatility and health pool. So Blood Death Knight definitely brings the best AMZ of the 3 Death Knight specs. So it has some really nice uses in raids to help mitigate some magic damage and help your healers out. It also has some pretty decent use in Mythic Plus, that you can use it on like a specific mechanic to help mitigate a little bit of mechanic damage there, and also help your healer out a little bit. So they do bring some things to the table. No group buff is definitely a little bit of a concern for them. They're one of only a couple of specs that don't really bring, or a couple of classes rather, that don't bring a group buff, and so even a party buff, so that's kind of a concern. But AMZ, AMS, and the battle res really just carries it overall. So if we're doing the math here, we see 4, 6, and then another 5 points, so 11 points overall for Blood DK. So on a max of 16, not a bad number. I think Blood DK definitely is above average right now. The great thing about Blood DK though is that their weaknesses in mob control and group utility are easily covered up by party members. So if you have someone that is maining Blood DK, yes, you're sacrificing a little bit of mob control and group utility for a tank that's very hard to kill and does decent damage, but you could bring in other aspects of your party or your raid to help kind of cover up that aspect. Now, mob control and group utility, a little less so in raid situations because you're focused mostly on just living and doing as much damage as possible as a tank. But in Mythic Plus, I wanted to include these because they are important in that Mythic Plus environment. Brewmaster Monk on a tankiness scale, I'm only giving it a 2. Brewmaster Monk might be the most paper tank right now. I don't know if it's just because of the kind of changing scaling and making Brewmasters stagger pretty weak. They're also very weak to magic damage. They're very weak to bleed damage as well, which is weird because you think that stuff gets staggered out over time, but it just, right now, stagger isn't doing the type of work that it needs to be done, or that it had been doing over the past 2 expansions. Now this could change as Brewmasters gear up, but based on the gear levels that we have right now, which is roughly 400 eye level, so even under what we're going to be getting in the raid, right now Brewmaster Monk is falling over in terms of testing on beta and things like that compared to the other tanks. It just doesn't handle things. Damage, it's doing a truckload of damage right now between Exploding Keg, Special Delivery / Rushing Jade Wind, whichever you decide there, but then also things like Charred Passions and a few other things are just making their damage absolutely insane. They are by far the highest damage tank by most logs, by most people's estimations, and by most people that I've talked to, and my own experiences as well. They do a ton of damage, but and it's all built into the base kit, but you struggle to survive. So you're kind of hoping that right now with Brewmaster, it's the best defense is a good offense type standpoint. Mob control, I'm giving them 2.5. Mainly Ring of Peace carries this a lot, but they also have the slow on Keg Smash. They have really good ways to displace as well through Ring of Peace, like I said, and then also Leg Sweep, very strong. Paralysis is a good single target interrupt on mobs that can't be kicked, and of course a melee kick always helps as well. So really good mob control. They can get away if they need to. Ring of Peace is, like I said, the biggest thing that carries this rating, but they have some of the best mob control of any of the tanks. For group utility, I'm only giving them 1 point, and that's basically because they bring Mystic Touch, which is going to be very valuable in a raid setting because you are going to have a lot of physical damage dealers and hunters, rogues, potentially even feral druids now, because feral is looking very strong for raid. In Vault of the Incarnates tier, warrior is obviously always there, and then even some builds of enhancement shaman do kind of like heavy physical damage, so they are going to be there. Obviously it helps your tanks damage as well. Most tanks are doing I think some sort of prop paladin does a little bit of holy damage. Most of these tanks do, and blood plague, I think, on Blood DK, most of the tanks do do damage, so that's an extra 5% damage on your tanks, which means a little bit more threat for them. Always a good thing. So overall, Brewmaster Monk is probably the tank that's in the toughest position right now. Let's see, 7, 8, plus 2.5, 10.5 points. Believe it or not that far behind Blood DK, but Brewmaster Monk is getting carried pretty hard by the damage number right now. If the damage wasn't as high as it is right now, Brewmaster would probably be sub 10 points and be single digits on a scale out of 16, which isn't very good. All right. Tankiness, Guardian Druid. Guardian Druid got some massive buffs recently that have really helped. They got a buff to Ursock's Endurance, giving you 2 more seconds on Iron Fur and on Bark Skin. So if you decide to take that talent, which it is optional in most builds, I've seen some people try it and take it. I've tried it out on beta, and it you know, just makes the tankiness feel a little bit longer. But it makes Bark Skin a 14-second duration, which is a long time to get a 20% damage reduction and a reflect if you talent Brambles, which you pretty much are right now. So really strong tankiness as well, through a 20% DR that's basically up every 45 seconds. You have Iron Fur, which is, it's Iron Fur. I've never been a huge fan of Iron Fur, but it is effective at what it does. And then you have Rage of the Sleeper, which is a minute cooldown, giving you a 25% DR. And then of course Incarn, giving you that big stamina boost as well while you're inside of the duration of the Incarnation. So a lot of really, really strong defensives. Survival Instinct's obviously another one that can go in. You only have 1 charge in most builds, unfortunately, because they decided to make the second charge a talent point that practically no one takes. And so go from there. And then you also have good single target damage reduction in Tooth and Claw procs, where your Empowered Maul make them do 15% damage less damage against you for 6 seconds. So overall, with the buffs that have happened, with the changes that have happened to the Guardian Druid tree, Scintillating Moonlight giving you 10% DR, when a Moonfire is active on the target, like just a lot of ways to reduce damage. And Guardian has a decent sized health pool as well, so even the damage that it's taking is heavily reduced, but also it can absorb a lot of it because it has a decent sized health pool. Believe it or not, Guardian Druid I think is one of, if not the tankiest spec. I think there's one spec that's a little bit better at it. Guardian Druid still does have weaknesses. If it's a massive hit for whatever reason, it doesn't really have great tools to be able to mitigate any of that. It's just kind of hoping that the DRs that it has up in that moment are enough to kind of keep it surviving. And there is going to be things like damage over time effects that are always going to take an impact on Guardian Druid, just because they, you know, are tough to mitigate in that moment. So not the best spec for surviving, but I think one of the best specs at surviving. All right. Damage, four points here. So Guardian Druid, I think everyone points to the 50% aura buff that it got to everything in its talent and its main kit except for Moonfire. As like, oh my god, that's massive. Like, how bad was Guardian before that? Like, it was pretty bad. But I think the damage component now is not so much the 50% aura buff, although I think it was needed and it kind of brings everything in line with other tanks. It's honestly really the Tooth and Claw change I think is the biggest thing, because getting free mauls on the Tooth and Claw procs that still allow you to maintain a defensive Iron Fur on other mobs, but also allows you potential for funnel for any AoE situations, I think is really, really massive, because those Empowered Mauls are hitting really hard and then also giving you the DR, of course. I've had Empowered Mauls at 398 item level or so on beta crit for like 45-50k. There's a lot going on to it. Oh, doubling back to the tankiness real quick. After the wildfire is also a big part. Guardian Druid actually has really good sustain numbers. After the wildfire is a big buff that basically every 200 rage you radiate out for I think 600% of your attack power and healing in a 12-yard radius around you. And it can crit, so I've seen crits as high as like 50, 60, 70k, which, you know, that's a big chunk of the Druid's health pool. Also has sustain through Frenzy's Regeneration and the Illune's Favorite, so really strong tankiness as well, which also is a big bonus for Guardian Druid. The damage bonus, obviously Thrash is still a big part of the kit. Thrash getting that big was part of that aura buff. I think that really helps a lot. Mob control. Guardian Druid has really strong mob control. I think it's actually the best out of any tank. I'm going to give it the full 3 points. Guardian Druid's always had okay mob control, but with these new talent trees, you're now able to get Incap Roar, you're able to get Hibernate and Typhoon, and Ursol's Vortex. Like, you don't have to sacrifice any of those. So that's 4 ways to displace or control mobs just within the tree. That doesn't include, obviously, the talent choice of Mighty Bash. Unfortunately, it's not baseline. And then you also can have, obviously, the kite mechanic in Ursol's Vortex. Now, Druid doesn't have great kiting tools. Ursol's is really the only one. But it does have the ability to keep mobs in place or move very slightly out of certain mechanics or move them into mechanics like the workshop solo pull that is done a lot right now. I think Druid's got some of the best mob control. It doesn't have great displacement tools, but it has great mob control for when the Druid needs the reprieve. Group utility, I'm giving Druids two points here. I think Druid is probably one of the best tanks right now. In terms of group utility, brings Mark of the Wild, which is a 3% versatility buff. You can talent into Innervate, which in Mythic Plus is probably a little bit of a drawback because it takes you out of form when you cast it. So please, Blizzard, put Innervate on Ursine Adept for like the 10th time in any video that I've done about Bear Druid. But obviously can be very valuable in Mythic in raid situations where you're not actively tanking and a healer needs an Innervate. You can shoot them the Innervate, drop back into Bear form, go to town. And it also brings the battle res, so pretty solid group utility overall. This could even be 1.5%, but I think the group utility of Druid is a little bit better than that of DK. So as you can see, Guardian Druid, very, very strong. Actually, I'm going to lower this to 2.5. I think there's one other spec that has better mob control than Guardian Druid. So we're at, what, 7, 11, 13 points for Guardian Druid, which is a very, very strong spec overall right now. I think it's one of the best tanks in the game right now. The big thing that kind of goes against Guardian Druid is even though it might be statistically or, on paper the best tank, as I've talked about before, there's still some fundamental problems in the Guardian tree that kind of hold it back a little bit. It kind of forces you into very little, there's very little decision making, very little freedom of choice in the talent tree, which could turn some people off. And just gameplay, for the most part, is pretty easy to pick up, pretty simple to kind of master in a lot of ways. And so for a lot of people, that kind of turns them away from Guardian Druid because they're not engaged playing it, which means they're not going to be that much engaged with the content. I personally love Guardian Druid. It is my favorite tank, kind of always been my favorite tank. It just was never powerful enough to overtake Brewmaster Monk when I played it for the end of BFA and all of Shadowlands. But now that Guardian's been getting its buffs, and I've been giving it, even when it was before the changes, I gave it some real good shot. I am back in my comfort zone with my favorite tank. Prop Paladin is really interesting because it can build very, very defensive and be very, very tanky. Prop Paladin, strangely enough, doesn't sustain that well right now because the change in the health pools, the 40% buff to stamina and things like that actually hurt Prop Paladin sustain a little bit. But it still has really strong tools. Shield of the Righteous uptime is actually higher than I think a lot of people expect when they moved the Holy Power generation away from Avenger's Shield and focused it more into Blessed Hammer, as well as Judgment, as kind of being the only ways that you generate Holy Power right now. Of course, Hammer of Wrath when you're at the thresholds or inside Wings, but your consistent builders are just Blessed Hammer and Judgment, which makes the spec fairly haste reliant, but it's kind of always been haste reliant, one of the most haste reliant specs. Even beyond Blood DK, I think Prop Paladin's probably been the most haste reliant spec. DK obviously even more so because it's the only two-handed weapon wielder here in terms of that needs it for a lot of different reasons. But Prop Paladin overall tankiness, I'm going to give it 3.5 stars. I think the sustain problem is really starting to hurt it. They probably need to look at some things like Word of Glory being adjusted, and Word of Glory is still on the GCD, which I don't understand. Same with Frenzied Regen. But for Guardian Druid, there's other, like, the amount of times I'm hitting Frenzied Regen is way down, whereas on Prop Paladin, the number of times I'm hitting Word of Glory is way up. And part of that's probably because I'm just not playing it that well. I'm very rusty on Prop Paladin personally, but it's still a spec that I think is going to accomplish almost everything you want in most content. But as you start to get into higher and higher content, so if you start to push, upper Mythic Raid, or you get into the higher and higher keys, you might find yourself a little bit, clenchy. A strong healer will be able to cover up the tankiness problems of the Paladin, in which case then you're going to be looking at a tank that I think is really, really solid. Damage standpoint, I'm going to give them 3.5 stars. Actually, no, I'm going to give them 3. I'm going to give them 3. I think they're among the lowest damage right now, but it's still not like bad. Like, that's the thing. None of the tanks do poor damage. It's not like Guardian Druid throughout most of Shadowlands, which was just way far behind every other tank. Or Vengeance DH, after they fixed all the Season 1 double dipping type stuff, it struggled in damage for a while as well, until they buffed it, I think, with tier set. So there's no tank that's really like that far down. I don't see any tank getting under 3. I think Prop Paladin's probably the worst of it. mainly because there is some really high damage potential inside the talent tree, but the way that the spec is designed right now, and at least at these gear levels, you can't really take advantage of them at this point. So you have to build pretty defensive in your tree in order to be able to stand up. Even with a talent like Sentinel giving you a massive stamina boost, you still need to kind of build very defensive to get as much high block up time with Holy Shield and things like that. Mob control, Paladin I think has one of the worst mob controls in the game. I'm only giving it 1 point here. Really the only way, it's got a single target stun and Hammer of Justice. It has Resplendent Light, which is an AoE stop, and then it has Consecration potentially in a slow as you go beyond that. Beyond that though, like yes, you can get silence on Avenger's Shield, but it's not as blanket universal as it was in Shadowlands. They made a lot of changes to that. And if you have to be able to stop mobs from doing things, like it's because of the longer cooldown. I say longer, it's like I think 1.5 minutes on something like Resplendent Light. You don't have a good way to do mass stopping. You can stop a lot of casts, you can interrupt a lot through your regular kick, your and your Avenger's Shield, but if you need to stun mobs, you basically, like if you need to stun multiple mobs, you're relying on someone else to do that. I think the mob control for Prop Paladin, never been their strength. It's never intended to be their strength because they bring other strengths to the table. Group utility, I'm going to give it the full 3 points, and I'm going to go ahead and bump up the tankiness to 4 actually, because one thing I forgot was Sentinel, which does give that massive stamina boost, and Holy Shield, something else I forgot to account for. So Prop Paladin, I think really strong, but definitely has some gaps in its tankiness that could potentially cause problems if not played around all that well. Anyways, group utility, full 3 points. Hand of Protector if you talent it, really good. It makes you allow you to wog someone else. You get Blessing of Sacrifice, Blessing of Protection. You bring Diva Aura. You bring a Battle Res. You bring Blessing of Spell Warding now as Prop Paladin. You can talent into that. You just have a lot of really cool things that can help make or break little things in the group, or even be like big factors. And it's like Spell Warding in a raid setting has always been really valued when Prop Paladins are good. So you go there, and then of course just adding in the battle res into already their really strong levels of utility just kind of puts the cap on the top. Prop Paladin I think has always been the tank that, yes, it's there to be tank, but it's also there to kind of be a support class at the same time inside a Mythic Plus setting, and in a raid setting, kind of the same role, but it kind of always is factored on if its damage is really strong. Alright, so 11 points for the Prop Paladin, on the same level as Blood DK right now, and I think that's about accurate. Prop Warrior tankiness, 5 points. It is the tankiest spec. It just doesn't die. Like you have to try really hard to die as a Prop Warrior, or you play really poorly. Has basically permanent ignore pain uptime, really strong shield block uptime. I think it's close to 100, if not 100%. You have spell reflect. You also have spell shield, which allows you to handle magic damage really well. Bitter immunity allows you to get rid of bleeds every now and then. Of course, you can also race into dwarf, but it doesn't really impact that because almost all of these could be dwarf except for DH and druid. So just handles almost everything well. Like it really does incredibly well defensively, in that you have a tool for everything, and that tool is very strong for everything as well. So overall, just like it's really hard to out tank a Prop Warrior right now. I think they're by far the tankiest spec. I put Guardian Druid at 4.5, but I think you could even argue that being 4, just because to me Prop Warrior is that far ahead of everyone else in the tankiness department. Even though it doesn't have any like casted heals or any sort of healing inside the kit, because you block so much damage and ignore pain is a fantastic absorb. The self-sustain option kind of goes out the window, and even something I think Pain and Gain allows you to heal over time as well. So you do have a little bit of built-in. Leech is obviously a factor as well. You can get Leech talented into your kit. Leech obviously very good for self-sustain on any spec that can make advantage of it. Prop Warrior has it built into their tree, makes them very powerful. Damage, I'm only going 3 stars. They took some heavy nerfs in their damage kits recently. They still do really solid damage. I just don't think it's as good as most of the other tanks. Actually, you know what? I'll go 3.5. I think they're better than Prop Paladin, but not as good as Druid or Monk. So 3.5 damage, I think is an appropriate number here, just because they do really strong, solid damage. You can switch into battle stance if you need to, which, depending on your Mythic Plus comfort, it might be a little risky to do that, but, you know, there might be it's a high risk, high reward type situation. But in raid, if you're not actively tanking, you can swap into battle stance, get the extra crit, go to town, and then when it's almost time for you to taunt, drop back into defensive stance to be that tanky motherfucker that never dies. So really good, strong damage potential. And I think as the prot warriors continue to get more gear and they don't have to talent into as many tanky type talents, you can go pick up things like Ravager and some other damage talents that are inside the prop tree, and I think you can see this shoot really high as long as their tankiness remains there. Mob control, I'm only going to give it 1.5 stars. It doesn't have the greatest mob control. You have Piercing Howl now in your tree, which allows you for that. You can get Intimidating Shout as well. Challenging Shout as a strong AoE taunt, but it doesn't really have anything that allows it to get away all that well. But granted, right now it doesn't need to do that because it can just stand in there and never move and be fine. But again, if there is instances where you need to kite a mob away and not have it hit you to like allow the bolstering to drop off or whatever the case may be because of a mechanic that's built into the mob or whatever the case may be, Prot Warrior is going to rely a lot on its teammates to peel. It just doesn't have really strong mob control. Shockwave is kind of the extra half point, but right now Shockwave is kind of tough to get to in the tree. A lot of prop paladins aren't taking it at this moment, so without Shockwave, this is a 1. With Shockwave, it's 1.5. Group utility, I'm giving it 2 points here. I think it has actually better group utility than most people think. Obviously, Rallying Cry is one of, if not the best raid cooldowns. Being able to give an entire party 20% extra health for an entire raid. You know, you're talking 30 people max in a heroic normal raid, 20 people in a mythic raid, even the 5 people in mythic plus raid. Like that 20% health can be very valuable in certain mechanics. It is one of the best defensive cooldowns, party-wide or raid-wide cooldowns in the game. They also bring Battle Shout to help your physical damage dealers, and it also has things like, you know, it has a couple banners built into place if you need it, but I think most of those have been getting nerfed to where they're not really all that useful. But Battle Shout, Rallying Cry, it also does a really good job of helping protecting others from damage through things like Intervene, where you can kind of take a big hit for a mob, or for your co-tank, or for one of your DPS if you need to. There's really strong group utility that allows it to be well. I don't think it's the best. I think Paladin obviously is the best in terms of its group utility, but I think it's right up there with Guardian Druid. It's just in a little bit of a different way than Guardian Druid. So overall, let's see, we're looking at 5, 10, 12 points for Prot Warrior. I think that's about right. It's one of the strongest tanks, and probably going to be the most popular tank for most cutting edge content, simply because Guardian Druid, a lot of people just don't like playing Guardian Druid, whereas Prot Warrior does have a little bit more, in most people's opinions, a more engaging gameplay style, and the fact that it's just so tanky that the loss of damage and loss of things like mob control aren't really relevant, because the mob control can be peeled off on the other tank. And honestly, the damage difference between Guardian and Prot Warriors right now does favor Guardian, but it's not by like a significant amount. Let's end up with Vengeance DH. Taking this perspective, I'm giving it 4 stars, 4 points. Vengeance has gotten a lot better with a soft rework of its mastery, where outside of Demon Spikes and meta, you're not complete paper, which was always a problem with the Vengeance DH throughout Shadowlands, and even really going into BFA, it was just kind of like if you didn't have either of those up, you were screwed. Now that they've kind of soft reworked the mastery so that you're still getting some benefits of your Demon Spikes, even when you're outside of your Demon Spikes, uptime has really helped the tankiness for it. Still has things like Firebrand, which helps do a single target damage reduction as well, so it's just really nice, really strong. Not the tankiest spec, but it's definitely going to get the job done. Damage, I think 4.5 is a good call here for Vengeance DH. I think this is one of the most damaging specs in the game. Does strong damage in all profiles right now, and I think it's, you know, you could argue 4 points here as well with Guardian Druid. I think they're about even in terms of their damage. But overall, I think I give the slight edge to Vengeance Demon Hunter just because the damage that it does in AoE is very consistent, and the damage it does to single target is very consistent. Whereas Guardian has really good funnel damage through the Tooth and Claw empowered procs, and I think slightly better single target damage. But it's AoE, you know, you're relying still mostly on Thrash and the occasional swipe. Once you get the 4-piece, that'll change a little bit, but with Mangle hitting multiple targets. But for the time being, you know, we're going into Dragonflight. I think this is kind of where they rank before we start getting any sort of real gear, real sort of tier sets, which are the only borrowed power in this expansion so far. But I think Vengeance DH has a slight edge on it right now. Mob control, I think Vengeance DH has the best mob control in the game. I don't know how much of it they can spec into now because of the changes in talent trees. But, you know, you had Sigil of Change, you have Sigil of Misery, Sigil of Silence. And then you also have things like Fiery Brand, and you can kite away very well. You have the best kiting tools in the game with Infernal Strike, or with Abyssal Leap, whatever it's called, to get away from mobs. I just think that they have really strong mob control. They now can get a Mass Stun and Chaos Nova as well. So they just have a lot of ways to keep mobs in place, or to keep mobs away from them if they should need to kite. And they have a lot of ways to stop mechanics from going off, which I think is just really potent. So I think Vengeance D8 is probably the best mob control tank in the game right now. Group utility, I'm only going 1 star here. Chaos Brand is pretty much the only thing they bring. Obviously that has very, very strong value in raid, with, you know, potentially having as many as 14 damage dealers, usually as many as like, you can have potentially up to 10 generally have some sort of magic damage, because you have some pretty magic damage or elemental damage based melee. You think of Unholy Death Knight, Frost Death Knight, both do a lot of shadow and frost damage. You have Enhancement Shaman, which does a lot of elemental damage in certain types of builds. And even things like Assassination Rogue Poisons benefit from the Chaos Brand buff because they're considered nature damage. So a lot of melee can, you know, a number of melee can take advantage of it. And then of course almost every range, with the exception of the 2 hunter specs, also take advantage of the fact that they have the magic buff. But beyond that, there's nothing really that Vengeance TH brings to the group in terms of utility that's going to help bail out another party member or another raid member. All right, so let's see. We're looking at like 8.5, 9.5, plus the 12.5. I think this pretty much lays out where I'm at with some things. I think Vengeance, like I said, the damage could go down to 4, and actually I think I'm going to do that. Let's go 12 points here. So really, as you can tell, I think Guardian Druid is the best tank on paper, but I don't think it's going to be the most popular tank, and I don't think it's going to be the tank that you see at high-end levels. I think you're going to see a ton of Prot Warriors, just because Battle Shout and Rallying Cry are going to be very powerful tools for raid, and in Mythic Plus as well. And then I think you're going to see a lot more Vengeance Demon Hunters, but I think Guardian Druids, some people are going to run a Guardian Druid as a top comp as well, just to get the versatility buff. But the thing about Druid is that its utility and things like that is kind of universal across most of the Druid specs. So Feral Druid's looking really strong, Wrestler Druid's looking really strong for both Mythic Plus and raid situations. So if someone only wants to bring 1 Druid to the party, there is a chance that you could fill either one of those 2 as well if you have a dedicated player of those specs. And then you just have Guardian Druid running along with it as well. So that said, I think that all the tanks are in a pretty good spot right now. Brewmaster Monk probably the one that's in the most need, and really it probably just needs a defensive buff in turn for an offensive nerf, like just rebalancing its power a little bit. But overall, I think all tanks are in a pretty good spot. If you're just someone that's looking to push heroic, you know, maybe a few early mythic bosses and just try to get like your weekly 15s done, not necessarily to max out your vault, but you know, you just want to push like that, any of these tanks are going to be good choices. I think this rating and this point system really is looking at kind of the level of content that I'm going to do, which is mythic rating, maybe not necessarily CE rating, because this will be our first tier as a mythic group, but also looking to push like 20 to 25 keys type levels to kind of push myself a little bit this season. I think Guardian Druid is probably the best tank on paper, but again, I think there's a little bit of a stain a little bit on Guardian Druid because of its playstyle. A lot of people don't find it all that engaging. And so in terms of popularity, I think this is what you're looking at. We'll create a new category right here. It's popularity. I think Prot Paladin is going to be the most popular. I think we're looking at this. It's probably the popularity rankings. Prot Warrior going to be the most popular. Vengeance DH I think will be right there with it, because anytime you can play a hyper mobile tanky class, people like that. Prot Paladin has always got a really good population number, even when it's not in the best position. Blood DKs, I think a lot of people that play Blood DK now are getting dragged away to Prot Warrior because that's just the better tank. And so as a result, you're going to see Blood Death Knight numbers fall off. Brewmaster Monk's kind of in the same position. I think they're still going to be pretty popular amongst the hardcore Brewmaster Monk players, but anyone that was playing Brewmaster because they thought it was really strong is probably going to be drawn away from it and moved into one of the other tanks. And Guardian Druid, even though I think it's the most popular tank, I think it's still going to be the least played tank, mainly because the playstyle and kind of some of the problems with the tree, I think, are going to drive away a lot of players. That's just my opinion, though. I'd say no need to go spreading it around, to quote Mass Effect 2, but I'm spreading it around on the internet right now. So, but that's my thoughts. Now, if you think that I'm wrong for any reason, I'd love to hear some constructive criticism in the comments. Don't call me like an idiot or anything like that. I'm just going to ignore you. I don't have time to deal with your, trolling, but I'd love to know and learn more. I play obviously a lot of Druid. I've dealt with a lot of Monk, and I'm learning Prop Paladin again, but I don't play a lot of Warrior, DH, or Blood Death Knight. I've gathered the information on that in conversations that I've had with Iconic's other tanks, as well as looking and talking to folks in things like the Titan Forge podcast Discord, and looking on the Discords of the class forums and kind of getting their sense of scope, even though the last one you kind of have to take with some salt. But I think this is fairly accurate in terms of kind of the general perception of most of the tanks from people that are like tank mains. In that I think most of the tanks are pretty close. I think you're going to see, even though to me, the strongest tank on paper is not going to be the most popular, because like the 1 point that you're losing, you're gaining a lot more in other aspects. And obviously, like I said, Guardian Druid just has like a stigma against it. That's going to be incredibly tough to break, because people have made up their mind about Guardian Druid for a long time. And despite the fact that it's really good, and I find it really enjoyable, it's just going to be tough to change people's mind. So anyways, that's it for this video, guys. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. Remember to like, share, subscribe. It does help this video grow, helps my channel grow. Looking to try to hit 1,000 subscribers here soon. I think I'm sitting at like 640, so I'm about 300-ish subscribers away from hitting 1,000 on this channel. So I'd love to be able to get there as soon as possible, and I appreciate all your support. Till the next video, I hope you're all staying safe. I hope you're enjoying yourself, you're having fun. Keep on gaming, and I'll see you all in the next video.